All right, now we're ready to proceed with the rest of the case. Drop in your intermediate return spring. And lube up the bore a little bit in preparation for the 2/4 piston housing. So what you want to do is you want to arrange the large cutout here so it lines up with the overdrive feed bolt. And then that's going to more or less align with the wide portion of the center support. All right, so the next thing you have to do is use a special tool to compress that spring far enough so that you can get the snap ring into place. So first things first, get your snap ring inside the bore. And just seat it all the way down like that. And then go ahead and insert your tool. There's a couple of different makers of these tools. I believe that either Rotunda or OTC makes the one that goes to all the dealerships. And the one that the service techs will use. And then there's other ones like this one, which I guess they can be for whomever. And the idea is to get this thing situated in the grooves, and it can be a little tricky. This one is a little bit harder to work with, but I'll get it in there. So you're using the snap ring groove for the overdrive clutches to more or less anchor this tool into, and then you're just going to crank down on the handle until you compress that spring enough to get access to the feed bolt hole. And then you may have to align it. You just use like a punch or something. And I'll show you where the feed bolt hole goes. All right, once the feed bolt's installed, go ahead and seat your snap ring. And again, you want the gap more or less centered on the 6 o'clock position. 6 o'clock relative to the top of the case, so basically the bottom of the case. All right, next, just go ahead and remove your tool with this one. I actually have to take at least one of these bolts out. In fact, I'm just going to take both of them out. Okay. All right, now that that's in, you can go ahead and, if you'd like, check your intermediate clutch apply. Okay, that sounds good to me. I'll show you where the feed bolt or the feed location is for second gear once we have this horizontal, because we're going to just do a comprehensive air check at that point. So next step is the Overdrive clutch pack. So you're going to go steel friction, steel friction, steel friction. And then the wide portion of the steel here between these two lugs goes in this direction. Just like that. Dot faces up, of course. And follow up with your snap ring. The same kind of deal, keep the ends at the 6 o'clock position. All right, so 4th gear's in, and then what we'll do is we'll check the clearance. So we have the dial indicator set up there in the case, the plunger on the overdrive pressure plate. Now we're gonna put some air in through the overdrive feed bolt and see what kind of clearance we have. Let's try it again. So right at 62 thou. So the book calls for between, I want to say 32 and 58 thousandths of clearance, and they mentioned selective snap rings that are available for for this clutch. That said, I have probably about 10 individual overdrive snap rings, and they're all 80 thousandths thick. The other sizes are pretty difficult to find, if they even exist. I mean, I'm sure they do. I've never come across a thicker one. And the frictions and steels are 80 thousandths thick, and there's only 2 pressure plates available for this transmission. There's one that's roughly a 1/2 inch thick. I want to say it's like 490 thousandths thick. Those go with the 2 clutch stack ups that for 4R100s that went in behind gasoline engines, and then there's the pressure plates that came in this transmission that comes in all the diesel 4R100s, and I want to say it's like 300 thousandths thick or something like that. But bottom line is that this is a very large clutch, so 60,000, 62,000 should not be an issue. There is an option to run a max pack, but we're not going to be doing that today. So anyway, we're pretty much ready to install the Overdrive drum / Overdrive planetary carrier group, and we'll set up the case horizontally, and then I'll show you how to do that. And this is using a method that assumes that you do not have the special tool that is that dealerships and other technicians use to install that assembly. Okay, now we're going to install the Coast Clutch drum and Overdrive planetary group as one unified assembly into the case. What I do is I'll position the transmission horizontally and do my best to line up the teeth on the overdrive frictions, and then I'll carefully insert the assembly into the case and kind of working it around to spline everything on, all the frictions onto the drum. So just a real quick note. I know I didn't film the disassembly on this, but if you have wear marks here on the lugs on the outside of the drum caused by the teeth of the overdrive frictions, if they're not too bad, but you can feel them, they're catching kind of on your fingernails or whatever, what you could do is just take some 400 grit sandpaper and knock them down. If they're really bad, like they're like deep cuts, sandpaper is not going to work. You're going to have to replace the drum. So just something to keep in mind, because you don't want the overdrive frictions catching on the drum while they're trying to apply. All right, so we're going to go ahead and insert it. So I want to do it carefully and then just work it in. And it's fully seated, or you'll know when it's fully seated when it's slightly below the surface for the pump. Once it's in there, simply keep a hold on the drum and then raise the case back vertical. Now, if you're working on a PTO equipped transmission, this is going to be a little bit more difficult because you have that PTO gear in the way, but you can still do it. I mean, I've done, I want to say, about maybe 15 of those PTO transmissions over the last few years, and I don't see them all that often, but the method is the same. It's just that you don't have the hub to grab onto because there's the PTO gear in the way. But as long as you're careful with it and you take your time and you don't drop anything, you'll be able to get it in there no problem. Okay, now we're ready to install the pump for the final time. So lube up the case bore and the pump gasket surface. And then lube up the pump O-ring as well. Pump should drop in based on how we aligned it earlier on in the build. There shouldn't be any concerns or issues going in with it, but we'll see. All right, just Before you get set to drop it in, make one more check on the sealing rings. Make sure they're, good and tight against the journal, and that they're not going to get hung up anywhere. Make sure your bearing's in place. Make sure your thrust washer is in place. Lube up the bushing on the Overdrive clutch drum. And then from there, simply line up your bolt holes and drop the pump into the case. I like to use a screwdriver to keep me on center. Okay. If you haven't done so already, put all the new seals on the case bolts, the pump to case bolts, and then start installing them. You should be able to get a few threads in while the pump is still kind of halfway installed in the bore like this. Once you have everything all threaded in, all the bolts, at least, 3 or 4 turns, you can go ahead and start tapping the pump into place. And once you kind of hear that flatter tone, you know that the pump's fully seated. And then just run them down carefully if you're going to use an impact. Again, you don't want to strip anything out. All right, now we're going to go ahead and torque them up. 18 to 23 foot-pounds is the spec. So I got an extension, so I'm actually going to go to 24 because I know that you lose a little bit of torque through the extension. And then I just go in kind of a crisscross pattern. So I'm going to kind of pre-torque them first, kind of working up in 2 increments, so to speak. Because this makes sure that the pump's fully seated. Because if it's not, ideally you don't want to use the bolts to seat the pump. And then just go to torque. and then just torque them all the way around. You're going to collapse the little washers or the little seals in place, so that's not you stripping the threads out. It's just the seals collapsing a little bit. All right, we're all torqued up. Now we're going to turn the case back to horizontal and finish up the build. So once you have the case horizontal, go ahead and take your input shaft, and with the long splines facing into the case, install it. And just to check, make sure that everything is, spinning freely inside the case. So just spin it, go backwards and forwards, or, clockwise, counterclockwise. And all you're basically looking to do is confirm that there's nothing hanging up and nothing feels weird. So anyway, once you're done that, you can pull the input shaft out, or you can leave it in. And then what we'll do next is set up to install the parking linkage. All right, before we install the parking linkage and all that, I want to make sure that we cover both torquing the feed bolts as well as performing case air check. So the two center support feed bolts get between 8 and 12 foot-pounds, so more or less translates to 9,644 inch-pounds. So it's 13 millimeters for all three bolts, and I'll typically go 130 inch-pounds on the two center support bolts. And it looks like these are actually already there. So, and then for the overdrive, they get 6 to 10. Or I should say, the overdrive feed bolt gets 6 to 10 foot-pounds. So again, 130 is fine. You're not going to harm anything by torquing it a little bit more than that, but you don't want to get too crazy with it. Like I said earlier, you'd have to really get overzealous with the unsupported feed bolt to crack the case. As long as you stay within your 8 to 12 pound range, you're not going to have any problems whatsoever. All right, so let's talk about air checks. So here is fourth gear. This is second gear, your intermediate frictions. This is third gear, your directs or high reverse. And then this is actually intermediate sprag lube. So that brings me to the forward feed. And then down here we have low reverse. So here's overdrive. Intermediate. Direct. Forward. And then low reverse. So in the case of the low reverse pack, you just want to make sure that these frictions are moving freely, frictions and steels, that they're not getting hung up on the drum. And I think I mentioned that earlier when we were installing this whole assembly, but otherwise you want to make sure that there's no unusual hissing sound coming from any location. So when you have a nozzle like this, all I'm basically using is kind of a rubber vacuum hose. You really need to press down especially on intermediate and direct, but really all of them, in order to seal it off as best you can, so that air that's escaping is not, you're not having air kind of escape at the nozzle and make you think it's air escaping from somewhere inside the clutch or the lip seals or whatever. All right, so now that that's done, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the parking linkage, selector shaft and all that good stuff. And then we'll go ahead and install the servo for the coast band, all the check balls, and then I'll talk a little bit about the various updates or modifications you have to do to the spacer plates before you go back with them. And those are all per the shift kit. Okay, so next go ahead and install the detent roller in the case. So the little locating tab goes into the corresponding hole right behind the bolt hole. So it's going to be an 8mm bolt. And then this gets 95 inch-pounds, or at least that's what I like to torque it to. Next, move up the selector shaft. And when you install this, you want to install the outside portion facing the top of the transmission. Or pointed to the top of the transmission, I should say. And then your rooster comb and parking lever assembly is set up like this. So you have this portion here that engages the manual valve, and then you'll kind of insert the lever through the location in the back of the case where the parking mechanism goes, and then you just kind of seat it on in. Go ahead and install your retaining nut. Yeah, it looks like it's going to be 21mm. Not exactly sure what the torque spec on this, if there is even, if there is anyone, but just make sure it's snug. All right, last thing you want to do, at least on this part of the assembly, is drop in your retaining roll pin. And then just make sure it's flush with the case. All right, I'm gonna have to move you around so that you can see what I'm doing on the back side of the unit as far as putting together the parking pole and spring and all that good stuff. Okay, install your parking pole pin. Just tap one and make sure it's fully in there. And the next thing you're gonna do is install your parking pole and spring. Then go ahead and install your retainer plate. Two 13mm bolts. Make sure that the output shaft spins freely without any interference. And then check it. Make sure that the parking mechanism works. Okay, so that's that for that. And for these, you could just snug them up. Okay, let's go ahead and we'll put you back, give you a bird's eye view of the case again, and we'll begin installing everything else that needs to go on the underside so that we can finish everything up.